My girlfriend and I have been living together for a few years, and about 2 years ago, we decided to move to a new rural house. The house is in a quiet neighborhood on a dead end street with a huge property of at least 200 acres of farmland at the end of the road. We met almost all the neighbors and got along well with them. About 3 months after moving in, my girlfriend made an important decision on her own, without consulting me. She adopted a 9-month-old dog. The dog had no training whatsoever. Luckily, we had a big backyard, and most of our neighbors had dogs too, so they understood when the training process, including handling constant barking, turned out to be challenging. Aside from a few of my girlfriend's underwear going missing, we assumed the dog was to blame since she loved jumping up and grabbing clothes from the clothesline. Things were going well. Now, on to the story. It all started in the early hours, between 3 and 4:30 a.m. One day, about a week after adopting the dog, I came home from work and found out she had escaped from the yard. I called my girlfriend, and she said she'd be home soon. Meanwhile, I walked around the neighborhood asking the neighbors if anyone had seen her. Fortunately, many had. Unfortunately, the last time she was seen, she was heading toward the large farm at the end of the street. I went there only to find a huge fence with a sign that read, "Trespassers will be shot." Naturally, I feared the worst and decided not to enter. That's when my girlfriend arrived and we got the farm owner's number from a neighbor. She called him and he asked us to meet him in front of his house, right next to the property. The house looked abandoned, with a rusty fence and overgrown bushes invading the yard. Before we reached the door, I glanced through the window and saw something really strange. Mannequins everywhere, all dressed in lingerie and covered in something red. Maybe paint, but who knows. I exchanged a look with my girlfriend, and then the owner suddenly appeared, a middle-aged man, sunburned with a strong accent. He yelled that he had seen the dog and asked us to follow him. Although I didn't want to, I knew from neighbors' stories that he had already shot and nearly killed other people's dogs. So we went. He started asking my girlfriend personal questions, how old she was, how long we had been living there, and so on. Thankfully, our dog appeared, and we left quickly. After that, we reinforced the fence and tried to forget about what happened. But a few days later, at 2:30 a.m., while I was getting ready for work, I saw a white car parked in front of our house. At first, I didn't think much of it, but after living there for 4 months, I knew no one drove around at that hour. I turned on my high beams and realized it was the same farmer. As soon as he saw me, he drove off. I didn't go to work that day. I called in and stayed home. I wasn't going to leave my girlfriend alone. That night, I stayed awake the entire time, but he came back at the same hour for the next 2 nights. Every time I went outside, he sped off. On Monday morning, he showed up again. Fed up, I turned on my high beams and followed him, noting his license plate before he disappeared. I gave the information to the police and went home. Within 10 minutes, 4 patrol cars arrived. While 2 of them went to his house, 1 stayed with us until dawn. Later, we found out he had been caught driving 75 miles per hour, 120 kilometers per hour on the highway. Inside his car, they found 2 knives, a pistol, a rifle, photos of my girlfriend, and a piece of her underwear. We were terrified and immediately filed for a restraining order. Looking back, I know I should have called the police earlier, but I had never been through something like this before and underestimated the risk. It was a mistake, but I learned my lesson. Last weekend, I heard a story I had never known before when my uncle came to visit. He has always been playful, and during my childhood, he was constantly playing pranks and laughing. I had never seen him serious until that moment. My uncle is a big fan of cars and asked to see my new car. So I took him and my dad to my grandfather's garage to show it off. We did the usual, opened the hood, revved the engine, and pretended we understood what we were looking at. Suddenly, my uncle said he wanted to share something that had happened to him back in college, a lesson he thought was important for me. For the first time, he spoke seriously, and his voice carried fear. He trembled as he began to tell the story, explaining that he had never shared it with anyone before. But seeing my new car and knowing that I was young, he felt the need to warn me. He attended college in a rural area, where the campus was located in the middle of a small town with about 10,000 inhabitants, made up mostly of students and university staff, though there were some locals as well. In his third year, he moved into a house about 5 kilometers from town, near a bar district. One night, after drinking a lot with friends, he decided to walk home since he had an exam the next morning. As he walked along a deserted road lined with cornfields, a man in a pickup truck pulled up beside him. The guy looked like a friendly farmer and offered him a ride to save him the long walk. Drunk and not thinking straight, my uncle accepted. He got into the front seat and gave the man directions to the house he shared with his roommates. However, about 5 minutes later, he realized that the man had driven past the turn he was supposed to take. My uncle pointed out that the house was back that way, but the farmer, claiming he had lived in the area for 30 years, said he knew a better shortcut. That was when my uncle started to feel uneasy. He tried asking questions and assessing the situation, but the farmer kept driving with a clear sense of purpose. Eventually, they arrived at an old property with a crumbling barn, its roof partially collapsed. My uncle's plan was to jump out as soon as the vehicle slowed down. When the farmer finally stopped, he pulled the latch to unlock the door, but the handle barely budged, and the lock only lifted halfway. That was when he knew he was in trouble. The driveway was made of gravel, and there was an old, rusted, and broken playground in the yard. Behind the barn, there was a shed with lights on, but the rest of the property was swallowed in darkness, illuminated only by the truck's headlights and the moonlight. At this point, he abruptly ended the story, saying only, "I fought him and ran home." Shortly after, he added, "Let's go back inside." My dad stared at him for the rest of the night, but he remained silent. Though he never admitted it, it was clear that something terrible had happened that night. I got married at 19. My husband and I had no idea what to do with our new life together. We dropped out of college, and the rent for our small apartment was too expensive. We thought it was the perfect time to travel and have adventures before settling down. One day, we found an ad online. A man was looking for workers for his horse ranch. In exchange for labor, he offered housing and all meals. It seemed like the perfect solution for us. The man claimed to have extensive knowledge in various fields and promised to teach us how to build machines, work with wood, and even weld. In fact, we did learn to weld, which was pretty interesting. The pictures of the place were beautiful. He had built a large wooden cabin himself and promised us a spacious room. He also mentioned other people who had worked there, referring to himself as "we" in conversations. The ad seemed legitimate as it was posted on several platforms. We decided to buy our tickets. When we arrived, there was no one else on the ranch. The man was around 60 years old, but he was strong and energetic. One of the first things he said was, "I never judge people by their past. Do you believe they can change?" "I do." He seemed harmless. He took us to the market and told us to grab whatever we wanted, but his generosity felt forced, as if he were trying too hard to be nice. Soon, we started noticing strange things. The house he built had only one bathroom, located upstairs, with a door leading into his bedroom. There was no lock on the inside. He frequently invited us into his room. Inside, there was an old video camera and several tapes scattered around. He often talked about his passion for Japan and mentioned that many Japanese women had stayed at the ranch. He also commented on how many past guests had left suddenly, without warning. One day, he took us into town. We were in a very isolated rural area, so the trip was long. During the drive, he asked us to approach young people and invite them to work at the ranch. This made us uncomfortable. We're both introverts, and the idea of talking to strangers like that seemed really odd. But he got irritated when we hesitated. We ended up pretending to look for people while he approached others on his own. Over time, he started showing aggressive and temperamental behavior. While I never felt outright scared, I began to despise him. He was socially awkward and said inappropriate things. It was also clear that he didn't respect women as equals to men. Our parents always thought the trip was dangerous, but we believed we had done our research. However, we never thought to Google his name. That changed when I received an email from my mother. She was desperate, begging us to look up his name and come home immediately. So I did. We found arrest records for strangulation and sexual assault of a young woman. We also found articles warning about the ranch, calling it dangerous. Terrified, we bought return tickets. Now, we had to figure out how to tell the man we were leaving. He had mentioned multiple times the idea of us living there forever, starting a family. He fantasized about future Christmases with our children. I made up an emergency, and as I spoke, I could tell he knew I was lying. He seemed to anticipate exactly what I was going to say. His face completely changed. He was furious, but tried to hide it. Before I could even finish, he asked, "When do you need to be at the airport?" I replied, "Now." To our surprise, he took us there himself, using a friendly tone and saying he would buy our tickets if we ever wanted to come back. We thanked him and promised to keep in touch. Years later, I looked up his name again. I found forums where other people shared similar experiences. Many mentioned the exact same phrases: "I don't judge the past," "the strange bathroom," the videotapes, and even videos featuring young Japanese women. Some even uncovered a search history filled with Japanese pornography. Despite all the evidence, he still runs the ranch and the police don't have enough proof to arrest him. My story is just a small piece of the puzzle. I was lucky. Maybe I wasn't his type. That's why we got out unharmed. If anyone is interested, I can share more details, but I'd rather not reveal names. However, the blog where people share their experiences is far more terrifying than my own story. This story happened when I was 17 years old. 3 years ago, I worked at an old pizzeria on the outskirts of my city. To give some context, my city was a prosperous suburban area, surrounded by a highway that looped around it. Outside the city, there were a few farms and main roads where manual laborers had settled after the city was founded about 10 to 15 years ago. The pizzeria had been around for 20 years and mainly served these workers. It was around 9 p.m. when I received a call for an order of 2 pizzas and a 2-liter soda. I was the only delivery driver that night, so I had to go out for the delivery. The location was about a 10-minute drive away, but when I arrived, I had to drive down a gravel road, which took another 5 minutes. My car didn't handle the rough terrain well. When I finally arrived, I saw a nice house and 2 barns surrounded by a wheat field that was about 6 feet tall. I had always felt anxious around farms because I found the atmosphere eerie, and being alone there made my anxiety even worse. Since I didn't know where the man wanted me to leave the order, I decided to call the number provided. After about 5 minutes of complete silence, the man answered. He had a deep, raspy voice, like someone who had been smoking for a long time, which only made me more nervous. He asked me to meet him near his pickup truck at the farthest barn. My heart started racing, imagining all the terrible things that could happen. Even so, I gathered my courage and walked to the location. As I turned past one of the cylindrical storage units, I saw the pickup truck and the man inside it. Instead of getting out, I called him again to ask how he wanted to handle the delivery. With the same deep voice, he told me to get out of my car and put the food in the back of his truck. Since he had already paid with a card, I thought that would be the end of it. I did as he asked and walked up to the passenger side window so he could sign the receipt. The man looked to be in his mid-40s, was burly, had a scruffy black beard, and was wearing a trucker cap. I was skinny, and the thought of being kidnapped or murdered was already running through my head. When I realized I hadn't brought a pen, I asked if he had one. He stared at me with cold eyes and pointed toward the back of his truck, saying, "If you ask for a tip, I'll shove that tip down your throat." That's when I noticed a double-barrel shotgun in the truck bed. I froze in fear. He had just threatened to kill me. The most shocking part? This was the second time something like this had happened that same night. Earlier, I had mistakenly gone to the wrong house, and a man in his 60s, wearing a cowboy hat and a strange belt, had come out saying he had the right to shoot trespassers. Without a second thought, I rushed back to my car and got out of there as fast as I could. I drove so fast over the gravel road that I ended up damaging my car. I went straight back to the pizzeria and told my coworkers what had happened. However, they thought I was overreacting and treated it like a joke. I soon forgot about the incident, but a year later, during a lunch shift, the same man called and ordered a pizza. I refused to make the delivery, But because of the financial crisis the pizzeria was facing during the pandemic, management forced me to go. It was around 1 or 2 p.m., so at least it wasn't dark. When I arrived, the man was standing at his front door. He recognized me and started apologizing for what he had said the last time, explaining that he was going through a divorce and struggling with his emotions. He just wanted to make things right. He gave me the equivalent of $60 as compensation, but even so, I hope I never see him again. I lived with my wife on her family's farm until I uncovered a terrifying secret. Please listen to what I have to say. I met my wife 5 years ago. We dated for a few years, and since I had no close family, her parents took me in. We got married 3 years later. The farm was huge, with vast stretches of land up north, and they allowed us to live on a smaller property near the main house. However, there was one restricted area of the farm. Whenever I mentioned it to my wife, she would say it was where her family's meat distribution business operated. Only her father and 3 uncles were allowed inside, citing security reasons, but I couldn't understand why that justified it being such a forbidden place. During the week, I saw many vehicles coming and going from that area, some never returning. The isolated part was at least a kilometer from the farm's main yard. About 3 weeks ago, I decided to drive there with an excuse to try and get inside. That's when everything stopped making sense. As I approached the gate, a burly, bearded man holding a 12-gauge shotgun stepped out of a nearby shed. I had never seen him before, but he knew who I was. He told me I shouldn't be there and ordered me to leave. I tried to explain that I urgently needed to talk to my father-in-law about an issue with the cultivator, but he cut me off abruptly, saying he would let my father-in-law know and that I needed to leave immediately. I obeyed, but as I turned the car around, I glanced beyond the barrier and saw 20 or 30 people working. I also noticed a road leading far away from the farm on the other side, something that had never been mentioned before. That night, my wife told me her father was furious that I had gone near that part of the farm and warned me never to go back there uninvited. When I asked what the big deal was, since I worked with dangerous machinery every day, she just told me to drop the subject. But I knew she was hiding something. I couldn't stop thinking about it. My first suspicion was that the family was involved in organized crime, but I surely would have noticed. Unfortunately, the truth was far worse than I could have ever imagined. 3 days ago, I decided to uncover the truth. I woke up at 2:30 a.m. and silently left the house. I parked my car far away to avoid making noise and circled around the farm, taking a 7-kilometer detour to reach the road that led to the far side of the property. As I walked in the dark, using a small flashlight, I was caught off guard by headlights. I hid in the bushes and turned off the light. An official vehicle, escorted by an armored convoy, passed by. My heart pounded. I continued until I found a small opening in the fence and snuck inside. Inside, I saw 2 massive warehouses and 3 smaller cabins, all brightly lit. I approached a secluded cabin with the lights off. Peeking through a slightly open window, I managed to slip inside. The place looked like a storage office. Shelves packed with files lined the walls. I grabbed one and started reading. To my horror, it was a list of names, many marked as unknown. I froze when I saw a page detailing extracted body parts: liver, heart, kidneys, and eyes. The rest was simply labeled as meat for consumption. I collapsed to the floor, unable to process what I was seeing. I was unknowingly involved in a farm that trafficked human meat. Desperate, I left the cabin and headed toward the larger warehouse. Inside, I saw metal tables stained with blood, surgical instruments, and a door labeled refrigeration. The stench of death was everywhere. When I peeked through the cracks of the other warehouse, I saw something even worse. 5 large enclosures, each holding 10 to 15 people. Some were unconscious, others barely breathing. I tried to move carefully, but I slipped, making noise. 3 armed men got up and rushed toward me. I ran in a panic as gunshots echoed behind me. Luckily, I wasn't hit. Once outside the fence, I noticed security cameras everywhere. They knew that I knew. I rushed home, grabbed gasoline, and filled my car. That same night, I drove as far as I could. Now I'm over 1,000 kilometers away, but I had to share this. These operations exist, and one of them was right under my nose. I turned off my phone and got rid of anything that could track me. But if the government is involved, I don't know if that will be enough. If I get another chance, I'll update my situation. For now, take care of each other. Don't end up on that list.